Koka sunarai sunarayanti. 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 Koka sunarai sunarayanti.
Hello, hi, welcome to this new episode of the Mango TV podcast. Today I'm so grateful to have Chris Timmermann. Chris, PhD, is the head of the DMT Research Group at Imperial College London, where he investigates the action of the potent psychedelic DMT and 5-MeO-DMT on the brain. His empirical and theoretical work employs an interdisciplinary approach to the neuroscience, psychiatry, psychology, and ethics of psychedelics, their relationship to consciousness and application in mental health. The aim of his work is to explore altered states, such as psychedelic and meditation, to understand their contribution to the study of human consciousness and their impact on mental health. His work has been published in high-impact scientific journals and covered by mass media outlets such as BBC, The New York Times, and Wired. Thank you for doing this, Chris.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Giancarlo.
So, yes, I always repeat that, even if we're going to talk of, very out there topic of, cosmic consciousness and stuff like that, we feel that we wanted to keep a very conservative format for this podcast, very biographical, very personal. This podcast is a little bit the brainchild of a production company. We produced 2012 Time for Change. That was a little bit the beginning of my journey with the exploration in altered state, and the idea behind that documentary was that global transformation comes from personal transformation. So since then, I got very interested to explore what brings people to devote their life in psychedelic research, for example. So with your permission, I'm gonna bug you with personal detail and cathartic moment and stuff like that, if I can. It's not easy with you guys.
No.
Even with Dennis McKenna, for example, it was so hard to make him say I felt.
Yeah.
And with David Luke was a little bit easier.
Yeah.
And now let's see how difficult it's gonna be for you.
Well, we can explore it. Yeah.
Let's start from the beginning.
Yeah.
Childhood. Where were you born? Where did you grow up? What kind of values? What happened at home?
Yeah. No, of course. Yeah. Well, at first, I just want to mention that I think it's really important to start from personal experience. A lot of the work that I do comes in a very big way from a recentering of the focus of exploration, starting from human experience and putting that into science. And so I think, experience is fundamentally important. When it comes to the illegal compounds, it's a bit difficult to what it can be shared, what cannot be shared, and how to tread those waters when you're a scientist.
Of course.
So I understand that. But let's explore. Let's see what happens.
We just assume that any legal substance happened in country where it was legal.
My background is from Chile. I come from Chile, Latin America. For those who are not aware, Chile is like this little strip of a country that is between Argentina and Peru and Bolivia. So it's couched in between these countries facing the Pacific in South America.
Famous for his pension system and his architecture. Is that true?
Well, I think unfortunately because of the pension system, right? So there's a lot of issues there, and there's a social inequalities high in Chile, and that's also a big part of the backdrop. And so I grew up with these Western secular but Christian values, I guess. That's how I was brought up, in a family that was Christian, but
not really.
Very, how it goes. It's a loose kind of religious affiliation, but the values are kind of there. And there's, I think good things and bad things and tricky things, challenging things that come with that baggage sometimes.
But that's interesting because already, secular and Christian in theory is a contradiction in term.
Right. Yeah. I think it's interesting to think about the current times in which we live in which we're constantly confronted from the Western perspective on how it's like we need to learn how to navigate from coming from a place and having a set of beliefs and learning to live with other kind of cultures. And I think that's in a very big way the secular project in many ways. And that's, I think, one of the values of what we've achieved in Western cultures in many ways. I think, of course, there's a lot of challenges and horrible things have happened in the name of different religions. But at the same time, living in the UK, one of the most amazing things here, I find, is this ability for all these different cultures to not be completely assimilated in a given set of beliefs, but that are assimilated into a system of respect, of mutual respect. And I think that's incredibly, that's an achievement of human society, of Western human culture.
Yeah.
And I think it's quite amazing.
It's true that I'm driving like now. I rented a car here in London, and the radio. I was looking for a classical music, and there is Islam station, Muslim station, Christian station, evangelical, Methodist. It's interesting how all the beliefs are represented by different radios.
It's amazing because in some places you don't see this kind of things happening, right? And you see that the merger of the state and religion is much stronger, and it's more old-fashioned, and there's war, religious conflict happening in the world today. It's a thing, and it's been a topos in the human story for quite a while. This thing of religious conflict. And so I think this is one of the values to be treasured and appreciated of our culture. I think it's amazing. And so, that's broadly speaking, also coming back to the background, I think the values that I was brought up into in Chile. And in the backdrop of that is the idea of, indigenous and mixed race lineages and traditional lineages that are inherent to the Latin American culture. And so I think very different from North America and South America, the Spanish Empire integrated or made a very strong effort for indigenous culture to assimilate, the Christian values, coming from this sort of Catholic sort of orientation in terms of converting and missionaries and so on. That was a big, strong thing in Southern America. And so...
But so in Chile, there is no rainforest. It's more like the Andes.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's the Cuero.
Exactly. You have deep, intense forests down south, but not rainforests, like this humid, sort of jungly Amazon thing. You have pockets of that, which are like microclimates. But broadly speaking, what you have in Chile is like in the north, the driest desert in the world, which is the Atacama Desert. Then you have the Central Valley and the coast, which is where Santiago is. And then when you go down south, you have the most incredible, amazing sort of green things, green landscapes, forests, places that look like, the beautiful parts of Germany and Austria. In terms of forests, and parts of the UK as well. And then when you go down south even further, you have the Patagonia, which is this incredible, crazy thing with all these species that you don't find anywhere else in the world, these incredible mountains all over the country. And so it's interesting, I think, the landscape of Chile is this mixture between a bit this desolate thing of the desert and this magnanimous things of the mountains and the immense richness that you find in nature in very beautiful kinds of ways. And of course, the ocean. We have 4,000 kilometers of ocean, and it's one of the most intense and scary oceans in the world, the ocean of Chile. Everybody learns how to respect the ocean there because it's a hardcore ocean.
So as a kid,
yeah.
well, how did you interact with all this as a child?
Well, I think it's just in the background. So
Yeah.
you grow up. I grew up in Santiago, it's a big city, and it's like you have on the one hand the Andes on the one side of the city, and on the other side of the city you have this range of mountains that is the coast range of mountains, and so you're in this valley where there's a big city where 6 million people live, but you have this reminder of nature and mountains, kind of like in a way providing a sense of shelter and orientation that you always have there. And so for me, I went, after I left Chile, I went to live to Italy for a while.
How old were you when you left?
I was 26. I went to do a master's in Italy.
By your teenager years?
Oh, yeah, no, I just want to quickly mention that, just to say that when I went to Italy, there was no mountains there. I was in the Pianura in Bologna.
In Bologna.
And so it was like, it was almost like I felt anxious because you didn't have this sort of like hugging element of the mountains.
Interesting.
And so my childhood was just growing up there, the secular Western Christian values mixed in with the backdrop of, the indigenous traditions that are present in the culture in many, many different ways. So the idea of the evil eye or the idea of magical realism, which, this literary tradition that is very much inherent to Latin America, where precisely the point is this mixture between the hardships reality of Latin America with the magical elements of those indigenous traditions mixed in together.
Jodorowsky was from Chile.
Jodorowsky is from Chile, for example. So you have these examples of people mixing in these sort of like realities in many different ways, and so that was a bit the backdrop. Very inspired, very interested in the mind. I grew up as I think I was always fairly introverted, not necessarily shy, but definitely introverted, interested in the mind. And so one of my earliest memories is, what is this thing? What is going, how does this work? Like I remember, like, how does this work was just a question growing up. And so I think I also had eyesight issues as a kid. And so I think that maybe also drives the exploration within rather than without in many ways. And that was another thing that I think may have marked me in different kinds of ways in my story. So I was always interested in the mind, and it remained a topic of curiosity and inquiry.
You had any brother and sister?
I have 6 siblings.
Oh, wow. You grew up in a huge family.
Huge family, yeah. We're 7 siblings.
Wow. Your mother was busy.
Yeah.
She was pregnant for a long time.
yeah, exactly. She was
wow.
She was pregnant for
and
a
it
long
was a good
time.
dynamics? I mean, did you receive enough attention? I immediately think that 7 kids.
Yeah. Well, I consider myself to be very fortunate. When you're 7 in a family, there's a lot of figuring out, infighting, tolerating.
It's a good life school.
Yeah, we're all very different as kids as well. We're not like none of us. There's not a single person that is the same with each other, and we're all get along pretty much on kind of like equal terms.
Yeah.
You don't even have like inner cliques even within the siblings, and so. And I think that my parents did a very good job at like really making no distinctions between us.
You were like in between, older, younger?
Yeah, I'm in the middle. I'm the third. My mom married twice, but we all grew up in the same household, and there was never a feeling of difference between the siblings, and who.
So you have good memory of your
more or less
childhood.
attention. Yeah, very, very good. I consider myself very lucky growing up in a loving family.
Nice.
And so I grew up in that family, and I was always fascinated by the mind, and therefore when it came to the moment to choose something to study, a career or something to do in life, I think 2 things dominated my life at that time, and one was music and the other was psychology.
Psychology.
So I studied psychology. And so I developed somewhat of a career in music while I was studying the mines
At the University of Santiago?
at the university. Yeah, the Catholic University of Santiago, which is like it's a Catholic university. It's one of the top universities. It doesn't necessarily have any sort of
Yeah, like in
particular-
Milan, we have La Cattolica.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I studied there psychology, and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do by the end of it. Music had become a big part of my life by then.
You were in a band?
I was in many bands, and one of them started to take off. It's like when I was kind of finishing and wrapping up, I didn't want, I felt that the commitment of being a psychotherapist, I tried it out for a bit, like studying that and learning about it. It felt like coming out of university at 23, 24 years or 25 years old was it was like kind of ridiculous. Like, how are you going to sit as a 55-year-old and counsel someone who's in their 50s, whose partner died, and they are grieving, and they cannot, they need some form of personal development story around that, or they are alcoholics or whatever. And it just felt to me that the way to, I wasn't mature enough, or I wasn't at a stage where I felt it was responsible to do that.
Yeah, but nobody was even able to do that,
Yeah.
right? With talk therapy, to access someone's subconscious, which is unknown even to the people involved.
Yeah.
So it's not just because you were young; it's just because that discipline didn't work.
Well, I'm a big fan of psychotherapy.
Even today,
Yeah, I think
talk therapy.
I think talk therapy is like really important, actually. Like I've been a user of psychotherapy. I think that there's incredible value in finding the right person to do that. I am a big believer that that the way that we develop as human beings is in relation. And I think talk therapy is just one of the ways in which society has developed a way to do that. It's artificial because it's a job, it's a profession, it's a craft also as well, and it's put into the typical devices of Western societies. But I think it can be immensely helpful.
Yeah, Stan Grof says that talk therapy can be useful. You can develop rapport with the therapist, and you can get support, and you can understand the origin and the nature of your emotional wounds.
Yeah.
But an emotional wounds need to be healed emotionally, not intellectually.
Oh yeah.
He says that some of these people that do 20 years of therapy, like I think Woody Allen in his movie, you learn so much the nature of your emotional wounds that you can teach it.
Yeah.
But yet you can't transcend it.
Yes.
That's why I feel that things, like therapy, like compassion inquiry by Gabor Mate and internal family sympathy, like somatic therapy, I think is much more effective.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think, as societies, we go through different periods in different things that become popular, and these may correspond to the specific needs of societies at given periods in time. And I think right now we're refocusing on the body as a source of experience, as a source of trauma, as a
Knowledge,
source of
wisdom.
knowledge and wisdom. And I think that that's immensely valuable.
Yeah.
But I also think that we are thinking human beings, and we're relational human beings, and these things are not isolated. These things
it's all
are
connected.
in conversation.
Yes.
And this is why I think there's something really interesting about fleshing out and developing this idea of psychedelic therapy, because you have precisely that interaction when it's sophisticated. You have that interaction very much in place, where you have this sort of like, accessing the body from a bottom-up way, where you have a drug that induces catharsis, or somatic reactivations, or whatever you might phrase it, but you're couching this in a process of the cultivation of a trait and the cultivation of preparation and the development of like putting yourself in that right mindset, and then bridging whatever happened in that, putting words into that, making that into a form of meaning, that is developed in this relation, this therapeutic relation, that then solidifies and anchors into something that also carries out in life. And I think that that form of learning implies both of those levels. And so I do agree.
The emotional and the verbal.
Exactly. And
the
so I do
intellectual.
agree that the talking therapy can lend itself to over intellectualizing things and talking and not necessarily
feeling it.
But I don't think necessarily talking therapy has to be that. I think a lot of talking therapy can help you open up things in life and open up these forms of experiences and so on. And also, a lot of things require also thought and figuring out and like being able to step back. And so I think it's a combination. It's a combo.
It's a combination. Yeah. But it's true that the subconscious is so powerful. You know, like I was speaking with this friend of mine from Paris, and has been doing talk therapy for 20 years, and like, you know, emotional unavailable father, and she's been going for a series of emotional unavailable boyfriends, and now again she's with the emotional, and she was telling me about how is that possible. I know that it has been 20 years, but yet that subconscious drive that make this person that create pain familial, she yet cannot transcend it.
Right, yeah.
And because looking at these emotional wounds that has created this desire for recreating a situation, albeit painful but familiar, it's she doesn't have the tool to transcend that. And so I feel that something like, you know, Gabor would say, okay, you activate the wounds, or when, you know, I'm attracted because this guy, you know, is not emotionally supportive. And so he would say, when was the first time that you didn't feel emotionally supported? When I was 7, 8, and 9, my father was never really considering this and that. And then Gabor would activate that wounds. And then the whole work is to stay with the pain without talking, stop with the story, and just feeling it for months and months and months, until that feelings, you disidentify from the feeling. So you have the feeling, you have the pain. Some people feel it in the stomach, in the back of your, you know, you feel it in the body somewhere. And by keep on staying with it, it might take months and months and months, sometimes years. You don't let that pain inform your subconscious that then move your legs to go to the house of the guy, you know?
Yeah.
I don't know if it makes sense, but we're going to go back maybe.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I know a bit of Gabor Mate. I haven't done a deep dive, but I think this resonates very much with the beginnings of psychoanalysis and Freud.
Yeah.
And like working with the thing, and you know, like you have a frozen arm, and so what you do is you work with suggestions of like what's happening with the arm, and then healing happens with what he calls the abreaction. Yeah. So when the cathartic thing is connected with the intellectual insight, and then boom, you know, like dissolves the symptom. And so, I mean, I think the ways of psychotherapy are still being developed, and I think they will always be in development, because I think
we are in development.
Because this is the stuff of life. There's an interesting thing of understanding of mental health as if it was the same as physical health.
Yeah,
I'm not entirely sure about that, because I think mental health is just the mind, and this is the water in which we're swimming all the time. We will always figure things out. We will always have to figure things out, because that's the nature of life.
Yeah. So you were 25 and you felt completely unequipped to start therapizing
right,
people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then what happened?
And so I did, you know, like I was living in Chile, and I worked in jobs as a psychologist, like, you know, interviewing people that wanted to apply for companies, and then but my heart wasn't really in that.
As a human resource helper.
Exactly, human resource. I was working at like an advisory company doing that thing, and then, but most of my energies were put in music, and so I was, you know, like I had a band, and we were doing.
What was the name of the band?
It's called one of them was called Mecánico. And the other school was called Dr. Robinson. So both of these bands were there, and then one I played guitar, the other one I played keyboards, and I had a lot of fun. But it wasn't. It was really something that I didn't feel necessarily very fulfilled, and I always had a very strong intellectual pursuit. There's a strong tradition of consciousness research in Chile, consciousness inquiry that is very much reflective of this mix between the Western scientific understanding and the traditional indigenous perspectives. That is bred out of that. These beautiful theories about how the mind emerges from life and so on. My heart was always very much in that. And so at some point, I applied for a scholarship and I wanted to go to study in Bologna, neuroscience. And so that's where I started to develop my craft, which is science. And so I did a master's there. I studied the neural basis of
learning. You did a master in Bologna. Yeah, I forgot you speak Italian. That's why.
Yeah, exactly. And so I studied the master's there in Bologna. It's a beautiful place to live in. Really amazing. Very interesting, the difference, culturally speaking, also with Chile and with the UK. And then after living there for 3 years, 2.5 years, 3 years.
But can you elaborate? How was culturally different?
Interestingly enough, it was less conservative and more traditional than Chile.
How is that? How is that possible?
So it was less conservative in the sense that Bologna is like hardcore left-wing city. There's a lot of anarchic sort of occupied places. It's a university town with a lot of uprising and social activism and stuff like this.
I see.
There were, I think, at that time I encountered a lot about this sort of like people who were doing alternative ways of having relationships and open, open partnerships and stuff like that. And I was coming from Chile from like a much more straightforward kind of thing.
More libertine with Riccione and the party, hedonism.
Yeah, more hedonistic, which is part of the Italian tradition, right? And in many, many interesting ways. And so, and that, exactly. The value of pleasure. I think that was something that was novel to me, coming from
Santiago,
Chile, Santiago, and at the same time more traditional in the sense that it felt kind of old, like everything has been kind of done, like the city's all constructed. If you're an architect, it's not like you're designing new places, you're restoring things. Culture has reached its pinnacle, and it felt like it's a society just looking back on that past glory and trying to revive it rather than like moving forward. And I think, like, of course, there's people moving forward, but this is the general sense.
It's a little bit the curse of the old town,
and whereas in Latin America, in Santiago, there's this feeling that it feels young as a society. It feels like we're figuring out things. We're figuring out how to make things work. Social movements take into account the idea of indigenous living and traditions and into the social discussions about how to put society together and so on and so forth. And so it's also thought of as something fresh and new, like the human being is something to discover. Rather than something to optimize necessarily. And so I think that is expressed in the arts, is expressed in culture, and it's expressed in this idea that, well, you want to do something, maybe you just if you want to play an instrument or if you want to do something, you just bang it on and see what happens, and you get together with people, boom, and then you put a show or something. Whereas in a place like Italy, it's like, no, you want to do it right, you want to talk right, and no, you
Conservatorio.
You have to speak right, and you have to do this thing, and the classical, and so that was
a little bit of slavery in the past,
which is interesting. I mean, I'm not saying one is better than the other. I think it was just
an interesting
sophistication of understanding how things are different, I guess, and so, and so that was my life there. enjoyed it very much. I spent 2.5 years there, I think.
And neuroscience, did it satisfy your curiosity?
Yeah, very, very much. And so there's as I was mentioning, like there was this tradition in Chile centered around the study of the mind and consciousness that is based on neurobiology and neuroscience. And there's like these intellectuals in Chile that are very inspiring for a lot of people, a lot of scientists coming from there, that were developing strong bridges between the science of biology, the science of the mind, and Buddhism. And so they were bridging these different traditions, and they were generating these sort of connections between these things. But neurobiology was an important part of the question. And so it was a very disciplined way to understand the mind. It's not just understanding the mind as like, we're just going to do this circle of, or we're just going to do this Reiki sort of thing, or we're just going to do this indigenous practice sort of thing, which all are valuable things. But it brought in along the Western tradition, the Western tradition of science to understand the mind. And so neuroscience felt to me like, if I'm interested in the mind, if I'm interested in understanding how the mind works, and if I'm interested in understanding how the mind can be transformed in a process of therapy, for example, there's so much out there in terms of how I can try to figure out how this works. But if I can ground it also in biology, in nature, it kind of gives it an anchor. It gives us something to agree on as individuals. Mm-hmm. It's like, instead of saying, this is the way that psychotherapy works, and you say, no, this is the way that psychotherapy works because this works, like, this makes sense to me. But if we can both point towards something out there and say, well, this is happening to the brain.
Because evolutionary biology brought us there.
Yeah, like it gives you a common ground.
Yeah.
It gives you a form of starting to agree upon things.
Yeah.
Or it gives you a very pragmatic way to go about it as well. And so it felt important to incorporate that. And it just felt like a fascinating possibility.
And the degree in Bologna had this component of biology, which...
Exactly. So I studied neuroscience, and I studied with one of the people who discovered the mirror neurons. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you know the mirror neurons.
No.
Mirror neurons is like this. It's a long-winded thing, but it's quite interesting. So they were like the experimenters were studying the brain of monkeys, right, of apes, and they had an electrode in the motor area of the ape. And they were studying the firing of these neurons whenever the ape went to grasp something, let's say a cup, right? And so the ape, moved the hand like this, grasped this, and the neuron fired. This is like the neuron that corresponded to the grasping movement of the hand, right? And so what they found was that we've done the experiment is now done. All right, let's wrap things up and go home. The ape was still connected, the electrode to the ape. The neuroscientist went and grasped the cup to take it away, to pull it out, and they found that the neuron was firing of the ape, but the ape wasn't grasping. And so they said, well, what's going on? And so they realized that the same neurons that are in charge for movements are also firing when the ape was observing another person doing that movement.
Wow.
And so they started to develop this sort of like interesting research program where the idea that perception and action are really not that different. They're part of like the same continuum. And this research was then developed even further and further and further. And, some theories say that this is potentially the basis of empathy, right? That, what I see, the emotions that I see in you, the same neural mechanism is activated when I have that same emotion within me. And so it's a way for me to understand you, to reach out into you, to connect with you, these sort of mirror neurons. Anyway, so that was
yeah, it's very interesting. And it made me think that sometimes when you pitch a project, it's like you create this excitement as if it's happening, because
Right,
you're
yeah.
imagining it, right?
Yeah,
I
exactly.
think it's similar mechanism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, very similar.
Yeah.
And so I did that, and so around that time, this was 2013, when I was wrapping up my PhD.
Wait, the PhD you haven't
Sorry,
mentioned.
I was wrapping
The
up
master,
the masters.
master, yeah.
And so I found out that there was a conference happening in London that was devoted to psychedelics, and I was like, "Whoa, this is crazy!" I mean,
That was the Hoffman birthday? No,
no, that was the Breaking Convention conference.
the first the first
It was
one.
the second one in
Yeah.
2013, and I mean, I come from Chile. Like, this kind of stuff doesn't happen in Chile.
You were not exposed to psychedelic as a
Exactly.
kid
Uh,
with the band and everything?
it happened. It was part of the milieu. I'd rather not speak about the specifics.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, psychedelics were always a very fascinating interest. I remember when I was in school, I had taken a course in psychology when we were trying to, pick the courses that will determine the thing. And I remember being fascinated by drugs. This is school time, right? I was, I think, 16 or 17. Fascinated by drugs.
As a mind-altering substance.
As all drugs, because they were the toolbox to perturb the mind. Like, it was like, what? Like, this is insane. And
you take the little thing.
Exactly. I was reading this thing and I was like understanding how addiction worked, and I was understanding how, like how the opioids, they do the withdrawal, and then and the withdrawal mechanism in the brain that generates this addiction, and then reading about psychedelics, and then understanding cannabis, and and cannabis was a big part in what was happening in that culture at that time. In Chile, still happens. Cannabis is huge, and so it felt like, me, that I was always interested in the mind. You would have this toolbox. I mean, for me, it was insane. I mean, it's just like, this is crazy stuff. And so I was always fascinated by that. And so it went a bit dormant, the drugs thing, as I was studying and then getting into neuroscience and getting a bit my intellectual chops right, and my theoretical ones, my experimental chops right. And it reemerged as I was finishing my initial period of training in this conference. And I went to the conference in 2013. And I remember being like, this is awesome. Like, this is so amazing what's happening here. It felt like I'd encountered some sort of secret treasure or something. I mean, it was like, I remember arriving. It was a sunny day in London for some reason, which felt like, wow, that's nice. And is in the University of Greenwich, which is a beautiful place. And the first lecture that I saw was the one by David Nutt. He's hugely inspiring speaker in many different ways, hugely respected authority in psychopharmacology. And a feeling at the time of real excitement. It didn't have this complexity that it has now in the psychedelic field. It was really like this thing of like, there is this secret that has been dormant for 30 years in research, and it's coming out again. And there's these few things, and Imperial was just like an emerging name at the time, right? And so I think David had been there with Brovin for only 2 years doing these experiments with psychedelics. There was no psychedelic team.
Yeah, David Nutt was famous. He upset the government because he said that horse riding was more dangerous than MDMA.
Exactly, yeah. And exactly, so he was a controversial figure. He was a bit of a cowboy, and he was admired by the psychedelic community, while at the same time being hugely respected by the scientific community.
Because he was not using.
Exactly, still is by both fields. And so, I mean, I was absolutely hypnotized by it. That's what happened.
And then Amanda probably was speaking.
Amanda spoke, and David Luke spoke, and I heard Eric Davis, which I felt was awesome. And I just felt like there was this... I've always been a person of many interests. literary interests, scientific interests, artistic interests, and it felt like the conference had that sort of mix, multidisciplinary, and the science. You know, I go to scientific conferences, serious ones, and I think they're very important, very serious as well. This one also seemed to have something very unique, which, you know, it kind of was able to have all these different things talking to each other.
Yeah.
And so that was also like, wow, this field is so,
you
so
find
much
a common
fun.
thing of all your interests.
Exactly. So much fun. And I remember coming back and talking to my girlfriend and say, like, you know, I think if I go into this field of research, I'd be able to maybe dedicate my life to this and not think that I'm always leaving music behind or something like that. And in that conference, I met a very dear friend of mine to this day who was starting his PhD, the first PhD of the Imperial group, which is Mendel Kalen, who then connected me with David Nutt and Robin, and you know, I applied to a scholarship, got a scholarship from the Chilean government to study, you know, a PhD there at Imperial College.
And you got it?
And I got it.
Nice.
Luckily, I still don't understand how that happened.
That's amazing that the Chilean government gives money to Imperial.
I mean, it was crazy, and so I started my PhD in 2015, and I, you know, I devoted my studies, my second part of my training, my PhD, I devoted it to understanding what DMT is, and that developed into essentially what are the effects of psychedelics in the mind and consciousness.
That was your PhD thesis?
Yeah.
And you discuss it, you finish it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that was in 2020. And so I did my PhD from 2015 to 2020. That was all devoted to the neuroscience of DMT and other psychedelics, but mostly DMT, the effects in the brain and the mind. There was a big part of my PhD was also very much devoted to developing methods of phenomenology. So developing methods that are not just about understanding the mind, but also understanding the experience and putting the rigor of science into inquiring into that experience. When I first got into psychedelics and I started to do a PhD, my friends would tell me, dude, you're doing a PhD in psychedelics, but you're neglecting like the most interesting part of this thing, which is like the trip itself. And, you know, there was that intuition. I always agreed with that. And so there was a very strong commitment to, okay, like, what is this experience about? And how can we bridge and ground that experience with the rigor of science and neurobiology?
But why was the critic? Why were they saying you were ignoring the trip? Because you were more interested in look at what was happening in the brain rather than what was the feeling.
Right. I mean, it's more like it wasn't a critique on me or what I was doing.
It was a scientific
more
method.
on the broad project, the neuroscience of psychedelics, which is like, all right, okay, you found out that, for example, like, you know, you take LSD and the default mode network disconnects or becomes hyperconnected. Okay, so what? Right. And so what I think is interesting in that question is rather, what are the qualities of that experience?
Of course.
In that experience, how do they relate to brain activity, and what does that tell us about the brain more generally and about the mind more generally? So the focus for me became, how are these tools to understand the mind, which again relates, you know, we started with my fascination with the mind. Like, how does this help us understand the experience of humanity, of human beings?
What's for you the difference between brain and mind?
The difference between brain and mind, they could be the same thing. But the way that we approach and what we're talking about, they're different things. The brain is the apparatus that you have inside your skull that if I'm a scientist, another person is a scientist, can poke at it, you know, something will happen and we will observe the same thing. The mind is your experience. When I talk about the mind, it's the same when I talk about consciousness more broadly. It's about human experience. And human experience, I can study it by interviewing you, for example,
But not you can measure it.
or by giving you a questionnaire,
Yeah.
and you can tell me about what happened to you,
Yeah.
for example. But I cannot. Like there's this thing, intuitive way to understand it, I think is very interesting and actually quite important. There's this philosopher, David Chalmers, who speaks about the hard problem of consciousness. And the hard problem of consciousness fundamentally speaks about the challenge that science has to explain the intimate subjective quality of human experience, like the feeling that you are having right now as Giancarlo. How do you connect that with the patterns of brain activity that you might have in your brain, or what's happening in your body more broadly? We know they're related. I know that if I cut a bit of your brain out and put it out, your experience will change. However, what is that bridge? That is unexplained in science. And this is what's called the hard problem of consciousness. How is it that the brain relates fundamentally to mind? How is it that the ineffable, like the subjective quality of human experience relates to the natural biological stuff that's happening to you? And that hasn't been solved.
That's still a mystery.
Like that could be an unsolvable problem for science. That could be fundamentally a philosophical problem that we will always have, because these are two registers that just never connect. Or it could be a matter of empirical research and development and technology. And then we may be able to maybe solve it at some point. Yeah, we don't know. And so until we solve it, they are kind of like two different, I speak about them as different things, because it helps us guide the discussion and, understand what is that we're talking about, define our terms, and be specific about the things that matter.
But so so we are at Breaking Convention. You felt I found my purpose. This compound would allow me to explore in a way all the different disciplines I'm interested on, including music. You connected with David. You start working for Imperial College, and when was another moment of ecstasy? Like the same moment you had at Breaking Convention when you discover this field. When was the next big be high moment saying, I'm really excited for what I'm doing?
Yeah. I think the moment that we started to dose people we started our DMT experiments.
Intravenous. Extended states.
Yeah. So we were, I don't know if you want me to break down what DMT is.
Yeah, sure, of course.
And so, my research devoted itself primarily to understand what is the impact that DMT has in the brain. DMT is a molecule, psychedelic molecule that induces very powerful experiences. It's a molecule that is present in nature in many plants. It's also present in mammals in very low amounts, very, very tiny amounts. But when you inject it or when you smoke it, it provides this very compressed, intense psychedelic trip where people feel transported or immersed into what feels like a different reality many times. And in kind of half of the cases that we've seen, people interact with these entities and beings.
We produce it endogenously. That's been proven.
Yeah,
with the lungs.
There is a lot of evidence that we produce it endogenously. The ingredients are in the lungs to produce it. It's not proven entirely that it's produced in the lungs, but the ingredients are there. We know that it has been found in the brain of rats.
So we don't know if we produce it with the holotropic breath work.
No, we don't know that.
We can speculate.
That is pure speculation at this point. And also whether or not it happens at the moment of death and birth, that some people have claimed, that's
the
also
pineal gland
speculation. The pineal gland is speculation that has been mostly debunked, because what they've done is that they've taken rats, they've taken out the pineal gland, and they still see that there's DMT in the brains. And so you don't need the pineal gland to produce DMT. That's what some pieces of evidence are saying. There's still emerging evidence showing that the DMT levels in the brain may be high. And so this is it could play an important role in human experience. We just don't know what is that role, and we need more work to be done in that regard. This is a fascinating avenue of inquiry for sure. And so I did my these first studies, and the first.
But what sorry to interrupt, what connected you to DMT? It was Imperial that recommended, or because there was so many different other. There was psilocybin trial going on.
So at the time there was LSD development. They just
for creativity.
they was just doing the LSD initial brain imaging much before that. I funnily enough, when I first got in there, I worked for the trial that David Luke was running with creativity and LSD. I sat for a few people there. That never got published, unfortunately, but it's fascinating avenues of research.
Yeah. He talked on this episode.
Very cool.
On how it was problem solving for people, scientists that had been working on tectonic plate and different things, and they had a major breakthrough thanks to the LSD.
Yeah. And so,
so what drew you to DMT specifically?
So I think there were two reasons. First, one of them was it wasn't being researched at the time, so there was an avenue to further knowledge on something that was still undeveloped. And on the other hand, it's like it's a perfect molecule to employ in neuroscience and to employ in consciousness research because it's short acting. And so instead of having this kind of like long thing that happens with LSD or psilocybin, this long experience that has many components and many different aspects to it, with DMT you can capture the impact that it has in the brain and the mind before, during, and after. Because DMT induces an experience that lasts 10 minutes when it's injected intravenously. And so that's what we did. We did experiments where we injected it intravenously, and people were just having these experiences. And so I think when we were starting to get into it, and I started to do the research, that's when there was a second, huge moment of like, this kind of thing is like, it's like an adventure. This is quite an amazing, lucky job that I had. This is an incredible opportunity to understand these things. Why is it that there's a form of recurrence on the fact that people see entities? What is it, this thing that there's a drug that induces presences? Why is it that what these presences have to say appear to be very meaningful and fundamental for people? Why is it that it connects people with themes of life and death? How is it that these experiences are inducing a form of ontological shock, a sort of realization or a feeling that the nature of reality might be somewhat different? And so these things were like, I think those first experiments were like a bit of a moment where I was, okay, let's go. Now it's time to go down this wormhole and try to figure this thing out. And that was also a long period. And so not only did I do these experiments with DMT inside of the fMRI scanner, I looked at patterns of brain connectivity and all these changes and all these effects, but I also started to do naturalistic research and try to see, like, for example, how is it that psychedelics might impact your beliefs after you take it for the first time? And so I did a large scale survey based on that. And we showed that a single experience with a psychedelic such as DMT can dramatically alter your beliefs concerning the nature of reality.
Your ontological view.
Your ontological view. Your perception on what is the nature of both the nature of reality, but also the nature of the mind as well. Like theories of consciousness and stuff like this. And then that, while I was doing that, this whole kind of work, it became apparent to me that there was something very delicate about this. There was something both potentially precious for people undergoing these experiences, but also delicate. These are strong experiences. I was seeing that some people were maybe getting a bit too fascinated with this this whole alternate reality, or people going down this wormhole in a bit of an obsessive way sometimes, and then sometimes people like smoking DMT every day for, I don't know, months, and then coming back and saying, Chris, I'm convinced about this, like going to the DMT researcher talking about these things. And then at the same time, I saw that, there was this kind of like emerging thing happening in parallel with the clinical applications of psychedelics. I mean, in the lab that I was working, there was these trials going on. So around the third year of my PhD, the Center for Psychedelic Research was created. Michael Pollan's book comes out, and there's this like explosion of interest in this thing. And at the same time, there's this feeling of like, just putting all these things together, a feeling of like this thing becoming very much a fixture of the wellness industry in many ways. And a certain trivialization or banalization of the experience, and, like something like kind of like it was kind of losing its depth, potentially losing that form of depth when it was coming into this broader discourse, which is normal and expected to happen. So I started to see that there was a bit of an ethical thing coming up. And so you have these molecules that impact the nature of the mind, so impact the beliefs that people may have, may induce some form of conspiracy theories if people are not in the right container for the experiences, can induce a form maybe of obsession for some individuals. And what I was seeing in the clinical trials, maybe even bringing up false memories and false, false memories that can deal with abuse, for example. And so another aspect of the research, so the first is DMT, the other one is like beliefs, and then the other one was like the ethical aspects of this. And so a strong focus on what is the nature of these insights that people are having. They feel true to people, and that appears to be driving the therapeutic benefits in a very big degree. And also those insights appear to be the source of distress. These false memories, these conspiracy theories that can happen. And not to say that all these things are bad things, right? But in certain contexts, they can be problematic for the person.
But the conspiracy theory is some sort of like paranoid behavior.
Yeah, like the guy that stormed the Capitol, the shaman, what was his? There was a name for the guy.
Yeah, I can visualize him with the horns and everything.
That guy.
Yeah.
Right, and so, and the spiritual bypassing element.
Yeah.
And so all this were aspects that concerned the nature of that psychedelic experience as well. And so this sort of like impact that psychedelics have on the mind, inducing these experiences that appear to be transformative, and these insights that appear to be very much revealing to individuals and helping individuals, but also on other occasions or for other individuals causing forms of distress. And so, developing this idea that these experiences can act as a double-edged sword. And so the question arising of how is it that this practice is enabled, and this awareness, this realization that this is not a passive thing that just happens to you, and in a way that may be needed is a form of cultivation of sophisticated practice around psychedelics. And this is very intuitive for many indigenous practitioners, for many psychotherapists that employ psychedelic therapies and so on. And for many psychonauts that engage with the practices themselves. But for many individuals, this is not obvious.
That you need practice to become better at something.
Exactly. Like this is a skill. This is not you taking, like having a beer, like every weekend or something. This is like a ritual, or this is a form of science, or this is a form of inquiry into the mind. And so at the tail end of that, becoming interested in the idea of, for example, of meditation as a form of cultivation of a practice that has these sort of parallels as a lineage of development of practice of generations after generations, where they kind of perfect these rituals, these practices, these ways of doing things that are sophisticated, that could somehow help people navigate these insights so that they are safe but also meaningful.
Interesting.
And I think this is something that we're developing, and we will continue developing. I think it's just inherent to it.
Nice. So that was the answer to my question of when was the second time you felt really excited?
Yeah. I give you like many things that I felt excited
No,
about.
but
Yeah.
you know, this is very interesting. It's important because people still don't understand to what extent this trip into your psyche is really like a trip on an active volcano, and you need a guide. You need to be able to, help navigation and also some insight on where you want to go.
Yeah.
But so this, the third legs of your research, you said, okay, the first one is the effect of the DMT in the brain. The second one is, what was the second one?
The second one was like the impact on beliefs.
The impact on belief ontologically, what you
Yeah.
think about it. And the third one is how you can develop skills to improve the chance of a positive outcome and a useful outcome.
Exactly. And at the tail end of that,
Yeah,
like how is it that you develop skills and so on?
yeah,
Implicitly and explicitly, that the what seems to be an important way forward is to bring an attention to experience, is to bring an attention into the phenomenology of these psychedelic experiences. And what needs to be developed is a skill of experience. And this is kind of like the avenue where I've developed my research since then. In the past 4 years, my first postdoc, and I'm pushing it forward now as I'm moving to a new institution and opening up a research center. And so these are the questions that fascinate me. These are the questions that I think connect the basic science, the nerdy, techie stuff, and understanding how these drugs impact the brain and the mind with the practice, with why these things will be impactful for people. How is it that they could help, if they could help? And how do we enact this in a way that is helpful for people and is meaningful and beautiful?
yeah. I'm thinking when you mention about the different ontology, sometimes I feel that our society is not really. I mean, in the psychedelic research industry at large, there's a lot of attention in drug development, but sometimes I feel when people talk about integration of this experience, usually it's 1 or 2 Zoom call, right?
Yeah.
But so sometimes I think like ontologically that word is so different. It's like you take the people from the caveman, like they take the Flintstone, you take them to Manhattan for 1 day, and then you say, okay, let's integrate that.
Yeah.
It's impossible, right? You need to go through 10,000 years of 20,000 years of sterilization. And so, and then I would see if I can try to bridge what I'm trying to say with the FDA refusing the approval to phase 3 for MDMA for psychedelic, for MDMA assisted psychotherapy. So, I live in Ibiza part-time, and there's a lot of ceremony, a lot of sharing, and it happens very often, maybe not very often, but often, that you have maybe an inexperienced younger person that is completely destabilized by what they see, because ontologically they don't have the framework. And if they haven't been prepared, they haven't been exposed, it's a cultural shock that can be hard on the psyche and might take weeks or months to integrate, and it's not necessarily like useful to go through that shock. So my question to you, don't you think that, and I'm curious to know what is this new institution you mentioned, together with the drug development and together with the patent and finding the permit to sell this drug, shouldn't be like creating more like educational center that start at least suggest a possible ontology like animist or panpsychist that would create a more, a more compatible worldview to avoid this clash. And until we're gonna stay stuck on this secular materialistic worldview, the integration will be difficult. Don't you think?
Well, I think that there's a lot to say about that. I am fully agnostic on what is the nature of reality, or the nature of consciousness. I think
Are
these
you really, or you're being politically correct?
no,
being
no,
a
no, no,
scientist?
no. I am like this is like
You might have.
this is my religion.
You might have a hunch.
No. Really, like this is like my. This is my religion, and I think this is the big part of the problem of humanity, achieving certainty in this. I mean, I think.
But it's not certainty, it's a hunch. I mean, you think that when you die, you die?
I have no idea.
Okay. I believe you.
No, but I truly, and I think.
You don't have a scientific idea because it's impossible
No, but
to
it's
prove
not
it other way.
But this is the thing. I mean, I strive to make this sort of endeavor of science very much connected to my personal thing, and I think, as human beings, our conundrum of existence is that we don't know that.
We don't know that.
Yeah, like this is the basis of what we are. This not knowing, this as Heidegger says, this being thrown into the world. You're just appearing into this thing. You don't know why, and we don't know where we're going. We don't know that the ultimate meaning of things. We just don't.
I mean, in the West.
But I also in the East, I think it's the basis of humanity that we don't know, and it's not to say that if people believe something, that's wrong. It's just that my view is very much agnostic in that, and I think that in the secular context that we live in, it's almost like that uncertainty is something that we're kind of cultivating in a way. Because if we have that full-blown certainty, then, well, I believe this, you believe that. Well, if you come here and you believe this is incompatible with this thing, war. And so I kind of think that it feels like a way forward to cultivate that, at least at the societal level, to cultivate a form of being able to inhabit the uncertainty of it. Now, I think that, I mean, I think that that's a real skill. When you talk to some people who are long-term meditators, not all of them, because there's different traditions and different things, but what the very good meditators sometimes say is like, whenever you feel that you've achieved this understanding of the nature of mind and you're inhabiting and you're like indulging in that, you have to like break frame. You have to like break it down. Like, don't stay there. That's the trap. Because the moment you stay there, conviction arises, hyper-certainty arises, and then that's when the tricks of the mind start to happen. And I think that's true to many, many things that happen to human beings. And from this secular Western perspective, I think that there's a way forward also with understanding the psychedelic experience from that perspective.
From an uncertain.
An uncertainty.
So rather than educational center on panpsychism and animism, you would have educational center that teach you to be comfortable with uncertainty.
Yeah. I mean, but think about that. This is the project of science. The project of science is this idea that, okay, you have a paper, you say, we found this thing out.
You have a thesis.
That is never crystallized.
Yeah.
There's always another person doing, but we found out now this thing.
Yeah.
So
it's a process,
It's always a process. And I think if I have a metaphysical conviction, is that life is a process.
Yeah. Consciousness
is a process. This whole thing is a process of figuring out. We're always in a process of figuring out things. And I think that there's a truth to this idea of understanding life as surfing, as like, well, it's about enjoying the process rather than thinking about the goal. It's about being able to inhabit that. And it's about developing the craft of figuring it out while you're a human being so that you can enjoy the act of the jazz of life in a way. And I think that that resonates with me from a personal perspective. And I think, yeah, also from a scientific perspective in many ways.
I see. Okay, let me ask you something else. Like my friend says that psychedelics are not for sick people. Psychedelics are for everybody. And so, so we are looking for, I don't know, 200-300 million people versus 7 billion people, right?
Yeah.
So all of a sudden we change the focus. And
Right.
and I agree. I agree that psychedelic is not just for the sick people, right? I mean, psychedelic as a form of self-exploration and self-improvement and healing and self-connection. I'm sure that is good for everybody. It with the right preparation, with the right education, with the right integration. But so, how do you see in the West preparing this society to offer psychedelic for everybody?
Yeah.
And if you can, in your answer, maybe comment on why what happened with the FDA and with MDMA.
Yeah.
If this is gonna also slow down the psychedelic, and is this the integration in the? Okay, let me just add one thing, because in the, we'll see what you say, but a typical answer is that okay, we start with the Western healthcare because then that's it's the Trojan horse. But then what I feel is there's something not right about this medical system is that it still follows this pathology diagnosis prognosis method, which is very reductionist.
Yeah. Totally.
And that only can work if the drug is directly meant to address a symptom.
Yeah.
If the drug is meant to expand consciousness and then use the placebo really to deal with the symptoms, it doesn't fit in the Western healthcare. So my question is, shouldn't we also try, like I asked David Luke, if you were the prime minister of the universe, or at least of this planet, and you could have unlimited power, what would you do to offer this medicine to everybody and not just to the sick people?
Yeah. Okay, so there's two things there. I mean, two questions it seems. So let me do the first, and which is about how to prepare everybody to have this. And I also want to clarify something that I just said, what I think is quite relevant. And the second one is a comment on the FDA and the medical model.
Correct.
So first one, and so I think that we live in a secular world, but also a pluralistic world. I also want to just qualify what I said about teaching people how to inhabit that uncertainty. And I think what I mean is it's just a larger project where I think people can have their convictions, they can have their beliefs, but I think what you kind of teach them, what you want to develop in society is flexibility and the capacity to adapt to change when it comes to these things. And so, thinking about an example, if my partner does something that upsets me, and I become mad at that, or I become a bit upset at that, I have to learn how to be able to communicate that. But I have to be able to say it. I have to have that conviction and feel it and say, I don't like this. This is a thing. This to me, this matters, and I want to communicate you that and I'm inhabiting that conviction, and I'm inhabiting my subjectivity, and I'm inhabiting this idea that I come from a place, right? I have my convictions, I have my beliefs. I can be a panpsychist, I can be a materialist, I can be a whatever. But in certain contexts, it's important for me to be flexible and maybe drop those beliefs for a second and inhabit other beliefs if it needs come to be, or inhabit a form of a loose touch, a gentle touch around these things
For conflict resolution.
Yeah, or rather than this massive sort of holding on to this belief, this is my thing, and if that is threatened, I am being threatened.
Identifying with that.
That identification process, I think. I think, what is it that we need to? So just to finish that thing that I just said, but also to answer your first question, how is it that this could be helpful for a lot of people is I think we need to develop some form of literacy about the mind. We need to develop a form of literacy about our internal states, about our experiences, and about how we identify with this process so that we can better adapt to change. I think this is not just relevant for the psychedelic stuff that's happening and the popularity of psychedelic use, but also for what's happening with technology and how society is changing at this rapid pace. I mean, what's happening in the world is vertiginous. The amount of change and the rate of that change is insane.
With AI and stuff.
And so I think that if we think about the skills of humanity, is this ability to change. And so I think, when I think about consciousness science and stuff like that, I'm not just saying this abstract thing of nerdy scientists poking into the brain and understanding the nature of mind, but also developing a form of education about our internal states. A lot of humanity has been about developing the outside and technology and stuff like this. And the time has come, I think, for us to be able to understand ourselves and how do we navigate what's happening in the outside world in a way that it is compassionate, in a way that is collaborative, in a way that is, resonant with the natural environments in which we live in. And I think that psychedelics can help in that in a large way. And I think developing those skills is what's necessary for this sort of like psychedelic engagement. And I think the values of pluralism in education are important. The values of adapting to change. I think psychotherapy is important as a process to prepare, and literacy about the mind. I think these are the important things. And we can talk about more detail if you want about, how is it that could be implemented in society. Going into the medical model and the FDA approval.
And is it the right strategy to focus on that first?
Yeah. On what?
On the medical model.
Yeah, well, so this is the thing. I come from the perspective that our understanding of the mind, this is the medical model, is that mental disease emerges from this thing happening in your brain. Like, the caricature of this is the chemical imbalance theory, right? You have a chemical imbalance, you have a deficit in serotonin, and therefore you have depression.
But we know it's not true.
I mean, the problem with that is that it's precisely what you say, it's reductionistic. And it's coming from this larger philosophical project where we look into the ultimate, we take a complex problem and we narrow it down to its finite solutions. But life is this complex and mixture, the spaghetti of mixture of things that involve your brain, involve your body, involve your life history, involve your relationships that you have outside of yourself. Yeah. And it involves also your perspective of the future and a range of other things. And so the remedy for this reductionistic approach is this ecological approach to the mind and mental health, to consciousness and mental health, right? And so it's
holistic.
Holistic is another way to put it. And so what I think happened with the FDA is just a reflection of that tension, is the fact that the way the FDA approves drugs, it doesn't approve therapies. And so the system is not geared for a combo application. The system is geared to approve just a drug. And so if you ask me about, what happened wrong, and some people criticize MAPS because they were like, they were overly complicated. They try to make this too much of, instead, if it would just been a drug application, they would have just gotten it and that's it. I think what they did was very ethical in that regard. They took it very seriously upon themselves and said, this is not just a drug. This is a drug plus therapy combo. And we're not going to go down this process without acknowledging that therapeutic component. And so I really take my hat off to MAPS because of that. I think that they really played the long game in that regard, and I really commend them because of that. I think it's very, very important what they did.
Yeah, and to avoid what happened with ketamine, which has been legalized without the therapy component, and now went too much
Exactly.
all over the place.
Yes, you're releasing these weapons of mass, like transformation, without the appropriate sort of container and culture surrounding that. And so I think, yeah, like, so it just reflects this sort of, I think the FDA approval on the one hand reflects that inherent tension. On the other hand, it reflects, I think also the problems that come with sometimes with a more extreme transpersonal disruptive view of things, where like the way that you can see it, right? It's like you have reductionism. So what you say in reductionism, you're essentializing biology. What matters to you, ultimately, what you think is the ultimate source of truth here, is what's happening in your brain, right? Or the chemical stuff. On the other hand, you could essentialize the mind or the soul. What happens here doesn't matter what's happening in your brain. What's happening really is source. What's happening here is spirit. What's happening is just this stuff.
Is a feeling of connection.
Yeah, if you just take that view and you neglect completely what's happening at the level of biology, you're essentializing experience. You're essentializing that. I have a strong conviction that the way forward is this
combine them.
middle way approach, where these things are interacting. And this is inherent to the thing. I mean, it's undeniable. The dose matters, for example. People speak about set and setting. Set and setting is massively important. Context and how it influences the therapy is key. It's key to attend it and understand it. But if you look at the studies, the biggest predictor of a specific response is the dose. You cannot neglect this hardcore chemical naturalistic component. And what this is, I think, making very evident that this is a dance, this is a conversation. And what I kind of find beautiful about this FDA sort of debacle thing and the discussions that are happening and the tensions is that they're shedding light on the fact that these reductionistic approaches are insufficient. You need to have both of these views. You need to have a view that takes very seriously what's happening in the brain, what's happening in the chemistry, what's happening in dosage, what's happening with contraindications, what's happening with the rigor of stuff, what's happening with looking out for boundary violations. And also you have to take a very disciplined approach to understanding what is the nature of those experiences, having a framework that allows all kinds of experiences that can emerge as potential source of healing, and understanding the relational, intersubjective factors that are also part of the healing. It's not just a drug, it's that therapeutic relationship. And there's more and more evidence showing that that's the case. That the more people have this rapport in the process of psychedelic therapy, the more they have these mystical experiences or these cathartic experiences, and the better they end up getting from these depression or other mental health conditions.
So you're optimistic about this conversation that is going on, and
yeah, I think it's just a necessary part of the conversation. I think it's the long game. I don't know what will happen in the short term and whether or not there'll be investment has gone down, but at the same time, what's happening in the US, strangely enough, is developed maybe now a renewed interest in what's happening.
With the new administration, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's that they say that there's I don't have any political affiliation, but apparently that they're trying to put it back in center fold again, and so I think
the psychedelic research,
psychedelic research and the psychedelic applications, and so I think that as long as we keep having these big effect sizes, as we say in science, of the interventions, that the interventions are very impactful.
What's the term you use?
Big effect sizes, like the size of the finding that you find in science around how they can help depression or anxiety or addictions. It's difficult for us to abandon the project.
Yeah,
I think more research needs to be done, and it's a call on to say, well, we need to have better models to understand the mind. We need to have these more holistic ways of understanding it, but not let go the rigor that is necessary to understand these things better. If there's a placebo effect that is undergoing here that has a big component that is interacting with the psychedelic therapy, well, we need to understand what are those components of the placebo effect that matter so much.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. I understand what you're saying about integrating the biology and the experiential, but I feel that this it's happening. I mean, the experiential and the spiritual has been saying, like you see at this yogi, doing this chanting and the breath work, and then you find Van der Koos or Peter Levine who mapped the autonomous nervous system and the vagus nerve, and you see we have all this nerve in your throat, in the chest. So the experience of transcending and the mystical experience of the chanting and the breath work is now confirmed by the presence of the relaxation of the vagus nerve. Maybe.
yeah, it's possible. I'm maybe it's out of my own lack of inquiry specifically into that, about the vagus nerve specifically. I'd like to know more. I'm not an expert precisely on that, but yeah, I mean, these are lines of research. We also recently published something that, for example, we saw that the way your sympathetic and parasympathetic system are activated predicts whether or not you will have an increase in well-being after having a DMT administration. So before having the experience, your level of fight or flight or relaxation in the body that we can detect in the body will determine
will
whether
inform,
or not.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, definitely we have more and more of the impact of the body and the brain and how they interact with these things. For sure, there is an integration that seems to be increasingly happen at the level of human culture. The thing is that it's a difficult one. This is not an easy to have a model that is sophisticated to understand these things.
Yeah. But you didn't, because as you know, I was a volunteer in the DMT extended state, and I don't remember you guys preparing my parasympathetic nervous system by
You didn't have a body scan? Because we do a body scan.
I had a body scan.
Oh, there you go.
But there is so many practice now. Just with the heart rate variability, breath work, you can relax your fight or flight, right?
Yeah. We do a body scan because that's what we've done in the past. It has worked. And
you can see the level of stress or tension. What was the body scan for?
The body scan is to relax you, to bring you to the present moment. So what exactly what we did?
Sorry.
What we did before we started this interview. I mean, a way to ground you, to bring you back, to lower down your heart rate.
Yeah, maybe I was so nervous I forgot.
But you had a good experience, right?
Listen, it might be too much information, but I already told David Luke. I felt a lot of pressure from one of the sponsors, from Anton, to connect with this entity. I just felt that I had to meet with the entity. So I felt I had a little bit too much expectation. And then this is a little bit embarrassing. I don't know if maybe this time we're gonna cut it, but like in the past, now I've been sober for 3 years, but my go-to way to relax my nervous system was have a drink, have a joint, masturbate.
Right. Yeah.
And so I was really anxious, obviously, for this experiment, right? And so, I didn't have the cannabis and the alcohol available. So I went to the third solution, and my trip was over and over and over this message that I had to stop with the energy leaking. And the signal was so fragmented and almost black and white. Yeah. And so my whole experience was, there was moment of bliss because it's a familiar landscape for me. So I always feel welcome there and I always feel supported there. But there was the signal was not clear, and my takeaway was, I joined a mystery school to deal with my energy leakage. Okay. And so I started a neo-tantric work around that. Okay. So that was amazing. And my wife found me really changed and much more connected for a long time after that. And she wrote a long letter to Anton. Do you remember when we were in Ibiza? And so it was an absolutely positive experience. But also, I want to mention in terms of, because that's super interesting for me. One of the most interesting part of research for me is when science confirms spiritual practices.
Yeah.
That doesn't make so woohoo anymore.
Yeah.
Like there is this Harvard doctor and PhD. He did his PhD on the sacral spine fluid.
Yeah.
Called Mauro Zappaterra, and we had him on the podcast. And basically, his theory is that this fluid you have on your spine that then bathe your ventricle and your brain is responsible for this mystical state.
Yeah.
And this is then I chat GPT'd in which esoteric or spiritual tradition is the spine considered like a vehicle to transcendence, and like almost all of them, from Kundalini to mystic Christian to shamanic with the tree of life, with so many traditions was about the spine. So where am I going with that? I think that
Fascinated by the
the integration of
science
both when they match.
Yeah.
Because I feel that ultimately what I would like to see with the psychedelic practice is more of this spiritual tradition, or rather spiritual practices, that then will maybe transition humanity on a more tolerant and empathic and non-conflictual base. Because ultimately this idea of this understanding of a larger, like a mind of large, or like explicit order that David Bohm is talking about. There's all this Western science. Aldous Huxley called mind of large. Is this idea that once you know that there is something bigger, then maybe the pressure on this lifetime and your individuality can be a little bit more subdued, and maybe we can reduce the tribalization, the polarization, and the war. And so that's my hope. That's why when I see this compound in the health in the Western healthcare system, I feel, but why not having like psychedelic clinic for the weekend, where you don't have to be a mental disease, where you can only just be like like a long regeneration weekend, where you can go with your wife if there's going through a crisis, or you can go with your 20 years old son who's out of college and is a bit lost, where is it like more like of a spiritual reset. But that doesn't seem to be in the card anytime soon. I mean, because the compounds are illegal, right? That's why.
So the problem, legality.
The legality. So the idea is that we go through the medical system to make them illegal. It was to make them legal, and then when they're legal, then maybe we can serve them outside the medical prescription. But the first step is legality, and that can only happen through the medical system.
No, I agree that. First I want to say that the possibility that psychedelics can be a tool for human development beyond just treating mental health conditions is a very plausible one.
More than plausible.
I mean, from a scientific perspective, I have to say, because you need the evidence to firmly say that. But there's lines of research that seem to be very beautiful in that regard. Like, for example, my friend Leo, who's doing it for conflict resolution between Israelis and Palestinians, for example.
Who's doing that?
Leo Roseman. That's an amazing sort of avenue of research, and I think very fruitful. Just the idea of thinking it as couples therapy, speaks about that, but at a more micro level. This thing of getting along, and it's absolutely plausible, and there seems to be avenues there that I think are absolutely amazing of development. And then there's the element of creativity, of fueling this capacity that we have as human beings of reaching out beyond our current state and developing innovative solutions, and find ways forward of development that are also ethical. That's those are the possibilities, and I think that's that is the next step in the research for me. You know, that this development of this research center is very much linked to also that idea of understanding this as a means to explore and develop the mind as well. And so, you know, one way to do that is just by doing the science, but also is to understand how these applications might work outside of these contexts too.
But so tell us a bit more about this new research center.
Right.
So is it official now? You can.
Well, I can't tell much details now. I'm just moving to UCL to start the research center together with Jeremy Skipper, who's an expert in language and the brain.
Nice. So UCL stands for
University College London.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so our focus is consciousness research, psychedelics, and meditation.
Amazing.
And so putting these things together and
is a big center in terms of funding and people and resources.
We're developing it right now, and so we're looking to find partners to help develop this and to make it into something where, you know, we can somehow propel these new avenues of development with psychedelics, these new avenues of research, understanding psychedelics in the context, in the natural context in which they're used, understanding psychedelics in terms of how they can be used as tools of insight or creativity in certain degrees.
But then you see, when you say understand them in the natural environment, you mean on a more animistic ontology.
Well, ecological, I mean, not just in the lab, but also how they're used outside labs in these natural contexts.
In the jungle.
In the jungle, it could be in the... I mean, this is a huge thing of like, for example, just to give one example of that, the whole question of psychedelics and nature connectedness, right? The idea that psychedelics make you resonate with the natural world, makes you aware that you are a living system in the same way that the natural world outside is a huge deal. When we think about our times of ecological crisis, when we are in a crisis of disconnection with the natural environment, and what we have to develop is to find develop a form of kinship again with the natural environment. Psychedelics are tools that can help us do that. That is a massive sort of thing. If the way that they do that is by bringing about an animistic perspective on nature, well, that might be, you know, fascinating way forward. From the point of view of consciousness research, there's still very open questions of to what extent are animals conscious, to what extent is a mammal conscious.
Plants.
We're opening that up very much right now in the research. Like right now, the consciousness research, the very serious scientific consciousness research community is like saying, yeah, we think like many mammals have a degree of consciousness that resonates with the consciousness of human beings. And a lot of people argue that all the way down to plants or even very elementary biological systems. And it's this hypothesis that in a very big way, there's a continuity between life and mind. And that somehow there is some form of cognition that is happening at the level of the cell that is simply bootstrapped all the way up into our human experience right now. These are fascinating, open questions that I think for many people, they become somewhat intuitive in the psychedelic experiences in different kinds of ways. And I think it's an avenue of exploration. Then there's another thing, and I think it's quite relevant to mention in that regard. Right now, how psychedelic therapy happens is this, you're laying down with the blindfold, eye mask, and you go in and you explore your things and you heal and so on. If you look at the traditional use of psychedelics, it's used in nature. It's used outside. And who's to say there could not be a way to employ psychedelic therapy also within that context? And so I think that there's a lot to do. There's a lot to figure out and avenues to develop. And I think, the question of human development more broadly is a hugely important one.
Fascinating. But so do you plan any new trial at UCL?
Yeah, so right now what we have like these two broad, areas of development right now. One, it concerns the development of DMT for insight development and creativity.
Insight development.
And so DMT extended, right? And so one of the things that we did in my postdoc, and this was supported by Anton and the Tillingham Initiative is, that you would somehow be able to extend that DMT experience, that I mentioned before, which is you inject it and you're smoking, you're 10 minutes in and you're out. You would be able to somehow extend that beyond those 10 minutes to 30 minutes or to 1 hour and a half or even longer possibly. We did those experiments. We developed that technology. It works. And opening up the possibility that somehow we can now extend the duration of that trip, of that experience, and also tailor it to the individual. And so, if you're an individual and you say, well, what I need maybe is not a boom experience that I'm immediately there, but it's a slow come up. Or it could be that, a slow come up, but then I come down and then I come back again. And so finding ways of personalizing this psychedelic experience. I think.
Also with therapy, maybe.
Potentially with therapy as a development. So we're interested in developing those tools that can personalize that sort of thing.
We're going to have to get ready to do another documentary.
Maybe. So that's one of the areas. And the other areas is, using 5-MeO-DMT. And so these are the lines of research that I've been developing in the past 2 years, and we'll develop even further down the line. My interest with 5-MeO-DMT is the same interest that I have with advanced meditation practices and the science of advanced meditation practices, is that it seems like in these states, consciousness appears to be deconstructed to a fundamental or elementary state. And so when people smoke 5-MeO-DMT, they lose the sense of self. But in the extreme cases also, they lose all thoughts, they lose all memories. All that remains is an experience of awareness. And so if you're interested in understanding how the mind works, again, like the initial impulse into this whole thing, you would have this sort of minimal model of the mind to accessing the canvas that is supporting the painter, the picture of experience, right? And so it's like understanding the basic structures of the mind. And so I'm interested in developing this research program further, understanding how does the brain conjure up an experience without a sense of self altogether or without any other thoughts. What is that brain state? What is the fundamental things that are happening at the level of the mind and the brain?
Wow, amazing.
So it's a deep dive into that. Yeah, so that's the other element.
Wow. So one last question to finish. I couldn't really get much of your personal experience. So let me let me see if where would you like to see yourself in 5, 10, 20 years? Like you wake up in the morning in 5, 10, 20 years, and what would you like to be doing?
I would really like to.
I mean, it's 3 different questions, I guess, right? 5, 10, 20.
5, 10, 20, yeah. Establishing a research program that takes the idea of consciousness and experience seriously, that that we could have the funding to do that kind of research easily, that we could do that safely, and that we could do that meaningfully. That is the project that I am invested in. I am invested in ways to explore and develop the mind in the best ways that we can. And my hat in this game, most of the time, is science when it comes to that. That's what I'm particularly interested. And I think this research center is one of those avenues. And so to develop that, that is my program, my research.
Amazing. Chris, thank you so much. Thank you for your work. If ever someone that listening to this episode who has extra money to donate to a research center, what should they do? Maybe just text me and then I'll put in touch with you.
That would be the ideal, yeah. Or contact me. You can look me up online. There's contacts. There's the website that I have, my personal website that is the Imperial. I'm also active in Twitter.
What's your personal website?
So it's the Imperial one. Right now I'll have one in UCL soon. but Twitter is the easiest way.
What's
also
your
to
handle
contact me.
on X?
X is at Neurodelia.
Yeah.
Neurodelia. I'm also on LinkedIn.
Yeah. So we'll
And,
put it on the show notes, your handle on X and your LinkedIn page. And so, what's the minimum donation you accept?
All donations are very much
All
welcome.
donations are welcome.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything you want to share with, with people interested in psychedelic? Any last thoughts?
No, I think just to mention that it's been a pleasure to talk to you and
Thank
hang
you.
out and then get to know you a bit better. And thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, guys out there.
Koka sunarai sunarayenti. 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 Koka sunarai sunarayenti.